Hi, this is Dr. Julian Teng. Last night, I posted an article on my blog for the 76th anniversary of D-Day. I was thinking about the symbolism of this event. 76 years ago, 150,000 more than 150,000 Allied troops landed on the shores of Normandy to defeat fascism. A lot of them young, a lot of them, had a bright future in front of them, and they risked their lives because they saw fascism as a threat to the freedom of others and perhaps also eventually to themselves. So they sacrificed everything. They risked everything, and many died and paid the ultimate price to defeat fascism. But 76 years later, today, we see that in an ironic turn of events, a lot of countries that joined forces to defeat fascism, there is rising new fascism, and this is something that is ironic, right? And I think in recent days the age-old racism story just popped up and caught people's attention again. And just by thinking this, I realized that, we always think the United States as the beacon of democracy. But I think it is as flawed a beacon of democracy as the USSR was a flawed beacon of socialism. And let me explain. And this is basically what I argued in this article. However, in the end, I said that there is still a difference. That the USA need not end up like the USSR, a failure. The experiment. The American experiment could succeed, and the experiment of democracy can succeed. So let me start by talking about Russia and why it wasn't ready for socialism. Marx and Engels envisioned a system where basically people were free to develop themselves to the fullest of their capacities without infringing upon the core mechanisms of the society. And this was at a time when when especially Karl Marx noticed the inherent injustice, the problems with the societies to that point, which was class struggle. And he basically mentioned, government was basically a group of people, the ruling class, oppressing the rest of the population, something like that. Right, and he pointed particularly to the cruelties and injustice of capitalism at the time, which was that people who control the means of production, compared to were basically quite oppressive over people who had no control of the means of production. And I think even to this day, we could see in some companies, some big companies, I'm not going to name names, during the coronavirus pandemic, some of them basically told their employees that either you come to work without protection, or you just give up your job, and because you give up your job, you're not getting fired, you're not going to get unemployment insurance, right? So this was a different version of pretty much the same story. So the problem they correctly identified, but the solution, they were quite light on solution. They did not provide, and they could not provide, a specific roadmap to implement socialism. And then the Russia experiment started when some revolutionaries finally managed to install the first socialist republic, with quotes, socialist. And I think this is a failure ultimately, because the Russian context was not right for socialism, because as a country, Russia, as a nation, Russia had never had true democracy, never had freedom. It was one of the cruelest societies up to that point. The conflict between the ruling class and the masses, the citizenry, was very severe. Was very oppressive. Perhaps this provided the environment for uprisings, workers' uprisings. But at the same time, it left the population largely illiterate. They did not understand the concept of equality because they never experienced it. And for this reason, while the leaders of the revolutionary has had good ideas, they were unable to implement it across the country. And I think that was the fundamental reason the experiment was a failure. They installed planned economy across a big nation, but they were unable to really truly implement a society to implement a society where people can develop their capacities, abilities to the fullest extent without constraints from the society. Perhaps rather to the contrary, right? So that was the Russian issue, and then I talked about compare this to the United States. The United States was one of the first countries to implement a republican model. It is still one of the longest lasting democracies in the world. However, democracy had a rough start in the United States, right? The country was built on beautiful ideals, right? The Declaration of Independence said this: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." It was very beautiful words. But the problem was that by men, right, with quotes, these authors meant white men who owned properties. It was not black men, it was not women, and it certainly was not white men who happened to be poor, because they were a different class. By men, basically, they meant that men of the same class but born on this continent, we should not be subjugated to a king who were not born here, right? That's basically the original idea. And it took 80 years for white men without property to gain the right to vote, even though the tax-paying qualification lasted until the 20th century. And we have very slow progress, right? In 1920, women were able to vote. In 1924, Native Americans gained citizenship only in 1924, and that was almost 200 years after the Declaration of Independence. And it was not until 1943 that the Chinese immigrants, the last of the bunch, were able to gain citizenship and the right to vote. In the repeal of the Chinese Immigration Act. Right, so so basically, America is a flawed beacon for democracy, right? But I think we shouldn't just lump them together and say that the USA and USSR they are both flawed, and the USA necessarily will end up like the Soviet Union. I think this is also because I think the United States is able to reinvent itself, and it has, in its long history, maybe not too long, but in its 250 years of history, it has continually reinvented itself and gotten slightly better. Sometimes nothing happens, and sometimes progress happens slow, and sometimes America has taken steps backwards. But the key issue is that America ultimately has been able to make progress, and it has never failed so far. I think it's because it is a country built upon ideas. The Soviet Union was built upon ideas, but I think the core difference here was the implementation. The United States, because perhaps in a very ironic way, because it developed so slowly its democracy, because it took baby steps, that the population gradually, how to say, developed into it, right? People adjusted their understanding of the concept of democracy, and now people really believe full democracy and equality for everybody. In Russia, it was different. In Russia, it was very quick change, very swift experiment of socialism, and at the time, because the population was not ready, they did not understand freedom, they did not understand democracy, they did not understand equality, never experienced it. They were unable to really fully appreciate any advantage, or much of the advantage, or most of the advantage of socialism, and so there was a low degree of acceptance, and this was, I think, the key. Right, so I think this was a very ironic thing, and I think 76 years after D-Day, perhaps the United States is ready to really again reinvent itself, and to really once and for all do away with social injustice, do away with racial injustice and sexual injustice, and perhaps all other forms of injustice. We will see. Right, in the next few weeks to a few months, especially leading up to the election, this will be the time of test for the American public and for the American experiment. Right, just quote Lenin: "There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen." So we will see whether these weeks will lead to some fundamental change that will salvage America as the beacon of democracy. If it does not, I think maybe the window of opportunity has passed, and maybe America needs to hand over its beacon of democracy to some other country, some other nations who are doing better, and it would basically then cease to be a leader of of democratic republics. I think there is hope, right? A story that I retold in that I wrote in the blog in the blog post, which by the way I will put in the description below, was told by Reverend Al Sharpton during his eulogy for George Floyd's murder. A memorial, and he basically said this story. When he was a young black man, protesting in the late 1960s, once there was a young white woman who came to him and told him to go home and the N-word. And this week, he was again protesting on the street, and he was talking in front of the camera, and then a young girl came, and he said he was at first a little bit a little bit afraid, and then the girl told him, no justice, no peace, and he realized that time has changed, that people have changed, just as I said moments ago. People change, and when the population change, democracy can actually adapt and evolve and progress. I think perhaps that was the missing element for the socialist for the socialist experiment. Perhaps Russians were simply unready for socialism, and being too fast, too sweeping, the experiment failed. And perhaps America, because the Americans are more getting ready for the next stage of democracy, and we will see. Thanks for watching this video, and I wish you a great day.